Hey folks, this is Riker, and it has happened. We finally got the massive, giant patch note document for Diablo 2 Resurrected. This is the first major patch Diablo 2 has received in over a decade. It is 30 plus pages of patch notes, balance changes, new rune words, new cube recipes we're going to dive through, as this will all be on the PTR starting next Tuesday, January 25th. This is the test server. Anyone can access this through the Battle.net launcher. So these notes are not final. This is what's going on the test server, but it gives you a great idea of the scope of the changes. And in general, when we have these test servers for Diablo 3, for instance, the spirit of the changes tend to be the same. Maybe some numbers are tuned a bit, but this is a good idea of what to expect is going to be coming to D2R. And as we go through all the patch notes here, we've brought in one of the Diablo 2 experts from Maxroll, MacroBioBoy, who's going to give his tremendous insight into what these changes mean, the ramifications, the implications. So let's dive right in here. All right, so kicking off with the Amazon, we're seeing a number of changes to Javelin and Spear skills. We're seeing buffs and reworks to Impale, Fend, Power Strike, Charge Strike, Lightning Strike, Poison Javelin, Plague Javelin. These are a lot of reworks to these Javelin and Spear skills. And Mac, is there any of these that you feel are particularly noteworthy? Anything to call out? Anything that's gonna shake up the game?
What you have in the Javelin and Spear skills are three different packages. So you have the physical Javazon, so that you're impaling your Fend. The big changes here is that we're attacking a lot faster with Fend, which is your only version of AoE, so that's going to be really impactful and actually make this style of gameplay more viable. And a really interesting change in Impale. It looks like it's always going to hit, and in addition to that, it's actually applying a slow. So the Javelin outside of the bow doesn't really have a lot of crowd control effects. So it's really interesting to see just how impactful and whether or not this actually instigates use. For the lightning melee skill package here, your Power Strike, Charge Strike, and Lightning Strike, the synergies are being reworked so it's no longer required to skill down into Lightning Fury. So typically you basically got the Charge Strike and Lightning Fury package all in one, but looks like the synergies are more insular just to these three skills, which means that you're going to have more skills to play around with if you just want to play a melee lightning Javazon. The last change here, and the one that I think is probably the most impactful, is how your poison javelin package is going to change. So the javelins themselves are now going to run off of their own cooldowns, just like every other skill. So you're going to be able to fire them off much more quickly and consistently. And the biggest change is actually to Plague Javelin. So on top of synergies being changed, there are two major changes here that I think are going to overhaul this skill set and make it incredibly viable. So Plague Javelin used to deal poison damage over an incredible length of time. It was basically like watching paint dry trying to kill something with it. But now its total poison damage is going to be delivered over a 3-second length. That is actually ridiculous. And then on top of that, the casting delay has been cut down to a quarter of its original time. So you're going to be able to use this skill once every second. That's 4 times faster than before.
Outstanding. And you think this is enough to really make Poison Javazons rise up a tier or more in power?
Honestly, yes. So right now, Plague Javazon is a density clearer. You would take this thing into cows to farm. The problem with it, though, is that you could only really farm on low player count and in multiplayer games with only a few extra people in your game. And even then, it was still slow going. With the changes just to Plague Javelin and no other skills alone, I think she's going to bump up somewhere to around a B tier density clearer. And that is without even considering the damage increase. Literally just the casting delay reduction and the fact that it no longer has a global cooldown.
All right, and then we have the developer comments here about these changes saying we wanted to give more advantages for using Amazon melee skills. So we are freeing up skill synergy reliance on Lightning Fury, which will make the lightning melee skills a cheaper skill point alternative to build around. Also, we are improving the power of the lesser used melee skills such as Impale and Fend. Lastly, Plague Javelin has received improvements with casting delay, damage synergy, and duration scaling to further diversify its usage compared to Poison Javelin. Do you feel that they were successful in these things that they're talking about here?
So they've definitely succeeded on the key points or the key takeaways that they wanted to establish here. The thing that I'm most interested to see is specifically about that Lightning Fury synergy reliance. Since you don't need to skill all the way down into that, I'm actually wondering where an Amazon puts these additional skill points. I'm not so sure that there are a lot of great options that weren't already maximized just by having 1-point wonders. But I think realistically, the Amazon in total is going to have, just with these changes alone, 3 significantly different builds, whereas before you really only had one and then kind of a Mimi second. So yeah, they've definitely succeeded in their primary goal here.
Creating more build diversity. That's fantastic. All right, that takes us to the passive and magic skills. Maybe that's the answer to where these extra skill points go. I don't know. We'll find out. So we're seeing reworks to Inner Sight, Slow Missiles, Valkyrie, everyone's favorite little buddy there, Dodge, and Avoid. Anything noteworthy over here, Mac?
Absolutely. So, and I'll get to the original skills first. The changes to Dodge and Avoid are something that have been plaguing Amazons forever. There was basically 2 schools of thought. Do you max your dodge skills and basically get dodge locked? You're basically unkillable, but you're just sitting there in a dodge animation the whole time. Or do you completely forego those skills and then lose out on that additional survivability? The fact that they're making it so that the animation will be interrupted and no longer lock you in a single animation means that Amazons get to finally enjoy the survivability that these skills afford and also play the game. If anybody has played an Amazon and gotten dodge locked for more than 2 or 3 seconds, they are the first people to immediately rage quit and uninstall. The first 3 skills here, I would say that the biggest change really to Valkyrie, this reduction in casting delay, makes her a lot more like the Necromancer's Golem. So you're able to proactively cast this spell and put a meat shield directly in between you and danger. So that's going to help out, more casual playstyles where you have to rely on the Valkyrie, more hardcore playthroughs. You're going to have a more consistent frontline defense. Other than that, we're getting a little bit of a buff to Inner Sight and Slow Missiles. People who use these skills already know that they're pretty fantastic, but it's nice to see them get a bit of an update just to stay in line with the other skills.
Very fair, very fair. The dev comments here, we wanted to add some quality of life changes to certain passive and magic skills, those casting delays, and the frame locking. We improved the radius for Inner Sight and Slow Missiles, and we gave more reason to invest skill points for Slow Missiles. Also, we wanted to alleviate the disadvantage of the animation lockout from using the Dodge and Avoid skills so that players are more willing to spend points on these skills. So, you think they succeeded there, that we're going to see more skill point allocation into passive and magic now?
I definitely think so. I would say that those 2 schools of thought are probably going to merge into one that I alluded to before. Basically, if you wanted to get down to Valkyrie, you had to take the dodge skills, but that also meant that sometimes you were just going to get dodge locked and there was no way to avoid it. So being able to skill down into Valkyrie, get a better Valkyrie out of it, and also enjoy the benefits means that you're not being punished for using an entire skill tree. So I'd say that this is probably the best way that they could have accomplished this.
Onto the bow and crossbow skills here, we see changes, buffs to Freezing Arrow, Magic Arrow, Guided Arrow, Strafe, Fire Arrow, Exploding Arrow, and Immolation Arrow. So is this going to culminate in Boazon's rising again?
I think yes, and I'm only a little hesitant to say that, but I wanted to touch on a few things here that might not be immediately apparent to the untrained eye. One of the biggest problems with your elemental Boazons, so your cold and fire Boazons, is just how expensive those skills were to use. You basically couldn't actually cast Immolation Arrow or Freezing Arrow for more than like 4 or 5 times before you completely capped out your mana pool. The Amazon just doesn't actually get mana per point. It's pretty sad. So those quality of life changes are massive and means that you actually get to dump into these skills a lot earlier. And again, you're not being punished for choosing a skill trait. The biggest change that I'm seeing here before we get away from the elemental skills is that Immolation Arrow is now going to have 100% scaling increase to its average fire damage, and that Exploding Arrow is also getting increased scaling in the later stages.
And that scaling means like, what exactly for how the damage increases?
Yeah, so for people who don't know, Diablo 2 scales your damage according to how many skill points you have. So there's actually 4 tiers of skill scaling. So basically what they're saying here is that For your earlier game points that you're going to put into it, you're going to see a little bit of an increase in damage. But once you get up to the 15 to 20 and then higher than that skill point cap, you're getting a lot more bang for your buck. So you're more incentivized to max out the skill rather than being penalized and not really getting any additional bonuses in the late game. Going back to both Magic Arrow, Guided Arrow, and Strafe, which are basically the primary package for your physical Boazon. Magic Arrow having increase converted over to magic means that you're going to more quickly be able to turret down any physical immunes that you come into contact with. And since Magic Arrow actually doesn't use any of your arrow count, it's really typical to see this used when gunning down a boss or something like that. So it's nice to see that more damage is being converted over to the much more highly valuable magic damage carrier than just physical. A nice little update to Guided Arrow. The big change here is to Strafe. Strafe previously only dealt 3/4 of your weapon damage, and it looks like you're now going to get 100% of your weapon damage per Strafe arrow. That's a massive increase, especially in the earlier game where you're forced to use less ideal bow options, and even sometimes using stuff like crossbows like the Bariza just to get a lot of additional power out of it. And now Strafe is probably going to feel a lot better in comparison to its typical opponent, which would be multiple shot.
And then the dev comments here, fire bow skills are receiving damage scaling improvements at higher levels so that they consistently fulfill their fire elemental damage type. Rolls for their level tier, also mana costs were reduced for the elemental arrow skills to give them more general usage. Strafe will no longer have weapon damage reduction and will also provide attack rating so that it can have distinctive advantages over the other physical bow skills. So in this 2.4 meta, I mean, there might be some other stuff in the patch notes that affect this, but your initial thoughts, do you think we're going to see multiple viable types of Boazons?
Absolutely. So I don't want to put the horse before the cart, but in addition to some of the new rune words which have been shown recently, the Boazon is in such a better place. And on top of that, you're going to be able to get into a competitive Boazon build a lot earlier in the game. One of the biggest problems with Boazon is that you realistically couldn't play her until you had a Faith rune word, a Wind Force, or a crazy upped Bariza. And now, with a lot more options on the table and also just better damage scaling across the board for all the skills, I don't think we're going all the way back to old school multi-shot Boazon that would just obliterate an entire screen. But I think we're going to see people experimenting and getting a lot of success on earlier game Boazons that are going to scale really well into the late game.
That's fantastic. I always really liked Boazon until I guess I realized that it... compared to certain other builds, like a Hammerden or something, or a Blizzard Sorceress, yeah, you had to get a lot more gear for it to be competitive, but I just always love that archery playstyle, so I'm very hype about these changes.
Yeah, the Boazon always looks really, really good until someone else joined your game.
Yes.
and now, hopefully, we'll be keeping pace with the Hammerdens and the Sorcerai.
Yeah, speaking of when you were talking about the magic arrow there, converting that physical damage to magic, I mean, anyone who's run a Hammerden knows almost nothing is fully immune to your magic damage, so it's definitely helpful. Alright, on to the Assassin here, starting with her martial arts tree. We're seeing changes, buffs to Fists of Fire, Claws of Thunder, Blades of Ice, Tiger Strike, Cobra Strike, Phoenix Strike, Dragon Talon, Dragon Claw, Dragon Tail. Man, when you really read them all off like that, you notice that.
Yeah,
the trends.
There's a bit of a theme.
Dragon Tail and Dragon Flight. So, is this going to be helping martial arts assassins, or are we still stuck with trap assassins forever?
I want to say yes, absolutely. I will be honest, we need to see what it looks like after testing.
That's
so
fair.
Let me go ahead and group up these skills just so it's a bit more digestible. So basically all of your combo attacks, so everything that's going to get you your assassin combo charges, your fists, your claws, your blades, etc. Across the board, they're getting better attack rating and then better attack rating scaling. And this isn't leaning towards the late game. It just looks like across the board, you're going to see better chance to hit starting at level 1, which is really important because the biggest issue with a martial arts assassin is that you need to hit to do your cool combo moves. So if you get into a rhythm where you attack 3 times and then use a finisher, if you didn't hit all 3 times and then you miss your finisher, you're basically not playing the build at all. And it's already pretty difficult to manage that, especially at high attack speed. So being able to more consistently stack attack rating means that your melee build is going to feel better in the early game and is also going to perform better in the late game. Now, in addition to that, just better consistency for all of your skills, we have the biggest change coming to martial arts, which is that your combo finisher is only going to use a single charge. So previously, you would attack 3 times, hopefully hit, get 3 combo charges, use a finisher, and then they're all gone, and you're starting back over at ground 0 and really not getting any benefit out of it. Now it looks like you get your 3 charges, you'll use a finisher, you'll get your big finisher combo, you'll still be at 2 charges, you'll attack 1 more time, and then you get to use another finisher. So while you still have that little bit of run-up time getting your martial arts assassin into gear, you're going to go finisher, combo attack, finisher, combo attack. You're just getting 3 to 4 times the payoff than you used to. After that, they're also bringing some pretty interesting changes here, and we'll highlight Dragon Talon. Dragon Talon now says, always hits the target if you have a charge, if you have a combo charge on. That's actually pretty bananas. The Dragon Talon Assassin, so your Kixin, is really the only thing people thought about when they thought about martial arts. And the fact that you have 100% chance to hit if you have any combo charges at all is going to drastically increase the total damage output on the Kixin. So this is your Uber Destroyer. This is your Boss Destroyer. You'll be running Uber Tristram in under 2 minutes with this.
Oh, wow.
And that's before the changes.
So I guess we still need to actually get to playtest these, but at the very least, it's certainly going to be huge quality of life and fun improvements for people that already are running these kind of builds, right?
Oh, absolutely. The one other thing, and I just realized this, across all the different combo finishers, it looks like you're now always going to hit. So this isn't just a benefit to the Kixin. You are actually going to see people dual wielding claws and using Dragon Claws as their finisher. But a really sneaky change that they snuck in here, Dragonflight, which is basically the assassin's bootleg version of teleport, as long as you have a target on screen, no longer has a casting delay. This does mean that theoretically, as long as you have a line of monsters, you can effectively teleport your way through any map at your max FCR breakpoint. I'm really interested to see what a game of 8 assassins all teleport kicking around like Liu Kang is going to look like.
That is big, because, I mean, arguably teleport is the most overpowered skill in the game. Everyone wants it. Like in Diablo 3, for instance, every class has some kind of mobility skill, and they're roughly comparable, but in D2, it's just teleport, and nothing even comes close. So now it sounds like something's coming a little close, at least, provided there are targets, and at least if you're doing bail runs or something, there do tend to be quite a lot of targets.
Yeah, for sure. I legitimately believe that this one change alone might be one of the big feather in the caps for going deep into the martial arts tree, especially early in the ladder, where people are not necessarily going to have access to an Enigma. And also, Enigma just isn't great on a melee build. You would typically swap to it, teleport around, and then swap off of it once you started fighting. So this is really big. I'm really excited to see all the martial arts assassins running around.
The dev comments here, martial arts skills are receiving a significant change, with having finishing moves, including the attack skill, only consume 1 of each charge at a time instead of all 3 at once. We feel like this will allow martial arts to perform smoother during combat by better maintaining current charges, instead of having to reacquire charges too often. In addition to this, we are increasing attack rating for charge-up skills to complement the smoothness of gaining and spending charges. Lastly, we wanted to improve damage payoff for the lesser used finishing move skills. That sounds like they're being successful in their intent there?
Yeah, for sure. This is one of the most exciting changes, I think, or at least personally for me. I love the fact that they looked at the martial arts assassin, they said, hey, this is broken, it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked for 20 years. So we got to give it a lot of love and let it prosper. And I think they're absolutely nailing that on the head.
Fantastic. Onto the shadow disciplines here. Reworks changes to Fade, Venom, Shadow Warrior, Shadow Master. In fact, let's read the dev comments first. We felt that shadow disciplines are generally widely used and effective, but we wanted to add some quality of life changes, so we added tooltip clarity, buff duration consistency, improvements and casting delay changes. So altogether, not as many changes here as in the other trees, but what are our thoughts on this?
Yeah, so it's going to be nice knowing that Fade actually gives you physical damage reduction, because nothing about this skill tells you that, and you just had to figure that out from one of your more knowledgeable friends back in the day. I think they're trying to hit that across the board, giving us more information on the tooltip, which just makes the game easier to get into for people who are new to the franchise. The only real thing to note here is that, again, like Valkyrie for the Amazon, Shadow Warrior and Shadow Master are both going to be able to be cast much sooner, so it's only a 0.6 second cooldown. Again, you have a more consistent frontline tank, you're able to cast it to interrupt monster flow and to help control the board around you, which is just, it's a really nice quality of life improvement there.
All right, on to traps. Hopefully Lightning Trap gets super buff. That was definitely an underpowered skill. So
yeah, it was a tragedy, really, because it was my favorite element, but we'll see what's in the notes.
All right, so traps here. We're seeing Shockweb, Charge Bolt Sentry, Lightning Sentry, Fire Blast, Wake of Fire, Wake of Inferno, Blade Sentinel, Blade Fury, Blade Shield. Lots of changes here to the trap skills. And the dev comments, with trap skills, there are multiple underused skills that can be more effective or have improved synergy distribution. For Lightning and Fire traps, we are freeing up synergy reliance on Death Sentry to give more build possibilities elsewhere. Also, Fire traps are receiving damage synergy improvements to make them more effective at higher difficulties. Lastly, the blade skills are receiving multiple improvements to make them more viable to dedicate builds around these skills. So what are we thinking here?
So this is one of the few places, because I'll go ahead and let you know I have read ahead. This is one of the few places where they're actually nerfing something a little bit, and I don't think it's immediately obvious. All of your lightning skills are having their Death Sentry synergy removed, meaning putting points into Death Sentry is no longer going to empower them. To offset that, these skills are getting more synergies from the other options in the tree. Now that sounds okay, but there is no traps and build out there that isn't going to use Death Sentry. If Teleport's the most broken skill, then Corpse Explosion is second behind that. It wipes out an entire screen by itself. So you're now being penalized slightly from going down the trap tree and still maxing out Death Sentry. So that's interesting. I don't think that it's a bad thing, but this is a slight nerf. Most trap trees are 100 plus build options to actually max everything out. I think in some circumstances you can't actually even max out every single synergy that you would want to. So you're going to still be able to get Death Sentry. It's still going to be powerful, but it's going to basically cost you more to still get the total output from the rest of your skills. It's nice that the tree is going to be more insular, so you can just pick up the lightning tree if that's what you want, or you could just pick up the fire tree if that's what you want, and you're not forced to also go into Death Sentry, but I can't imagine a world where you wouldn't still use that skill. Now that being said, Fire Blast is one of the more sleeper options on the Trapsin. There is just a Fire Blast Trapsin that just runs around and maxes out Fire Blast and blows up density with it. So it's nice to see that that first tier skill isn't as reliant on Death Sentry as it used to be. Other than that, we're seeing a little bit of a buff to the Fire Tree, Wake of Fire and Wake of Inferno. It's really nice to see that. I think everybody knows that the Fire Trapsin is super powerful early on and then basically fizzles out in its entirety and you're almost forced to go into lightning traps. But especially with the changes to area level and more farming places available, I think you're going to see a lot more pure fire assassins. The blade skills, there's a lot to unpack with the blade skills, so I won't bore you to death with it. But the long and short of it is blade skills are basically a pipe dream right now. There are some Blade Fury builds. They're not great. They all use Flesh Ripper, and they just underperform really across the board. So it's nice to see an increase to Blade Sentinel damage and Blade Shield damage. Blade Shield was kind of a 1-point wonder, and even then it really didn't perform well. But it really looks like they're trying to incentivize you to really explore the Blade Trapsin. And I think that this is something that will actually go really well along with the changes to martial arts. Blade Shield is basically like a free attack every few seconds. that's just in addition to how you're already attacking. So I'm really excited to see people actually play around with the blade changes. There's a couple nuances where changing the weapon damage actually makes your attack modifiers more effective, your poison length, your cold length, etc., etc. So that's going to need some deep dives into it to see just how impactful that is.
All right, so Blade Assassin, definitely something that when PTR starts next week, deeper dive to be done there. Otherwise, looks like Fire Traps definitely in a better place, and Lightning, bit of a nerf, is what it's seeming.
Bit of a nerf. I think they're trying to incentivize some experimentation with the Lightning tree. I can't currently imagine a place where you actually take those points and put them somewhere else, but I might be wrong. Death Sentry is just too powerful not to skill into IMO.
And Death Sentry being the sentry that causes Corpse Explosion, and Corpse Explosion is so powerful because it...
Yeah, so Corpse Explosion is a skill that says take up to 125% of the total health of the monster that you just killed and apply that to every monster around it. So if you're looking at a pack of cows, which all have the same amount of health, and you now deal more than 100% of its total life pool as physical and fire damage, it goes to reason that the math checks out and every other cow will die. The area of effect is massive, the damage output is massive, it's physical and fire, so it's really difficult for a monster to be immune to both of those. And on top of that, every monster that you kill then becomes fodder for the next Corpse Explosion. So that is arguably one of the best area damage effects in the game, at least on lower player count. And it's just so difficult to imagine a world where you wouldn't still skill into that because of how well it augments your already high elemental damage, whether fire or lightning.
Alrighty. That takes us on to the Barbarian. The War Cries tree, we're seeing reworks to Howl, Battle Cry, War Cry, Shout, Battle Orders, Battle Command, Grim, Ward, Dev Comments. We're adding more tooltip descriptions, more information always desired and appreciated, to War Cries for clarification on hidden skill mechanics. Shout and Battle Command durations were updated to be consistent with each other for quality of life purposes. For War Cry, we want to make it more effective and rewarding to use at higher difficulties. Lastly, with Grim Ward, we are adding a new functionality and synergy to give more reason to use the skill, which also gives more reason to spend skill points on Find Potion. Your thoughts, Mac?
This is maybe one of the most bonker changes that we're going to find across the entirety of the patch notes. I'm not trying to jump the shark here. I'll very quickly touch on some of them.
All right.
Warcry getting a damage increase is phenomenal. Warcry is already a really solid build. The problem is you really can't take it into higher player count. The radius is pretty small, so you're like really forced to be up in the face of monsters, which is fine since it stuns, but it's dangerous at first. Seeing a damage increase there is really exciting, just because Warcry is probably my favorite Barbarian build.
It's
who doesn't
hilarious.
like screaming at... Yeah, you scream at monsters until loot comes out of them. Who doesn't love that?
Who doesn't love it?
After that, so we, additional information in the tooltips. Grim Ward was actually the least used skill in Diablo 2. Find Potion had more use than Grim Ward. Grim Ward applied an area of effect fear on monsters. Okay, great, sure, they're running away from me, but I'm the Barbarian, so now I need to go chase them down and kill them.
Bingo.
The fact that it now applies a crowd control effect with a slow and increases damage taken from monsters within its radius is a very, very interesting change. I'm really interested to see how increasing damage taken actually works in game mechanics. So if we're reducing monsters' physical damage reduction, this might break immunities. This might be the third skill that breaks immunities in the game. If it doesn't work that way, if it just applies to overall damage taken, this means that your Barbarian is now bringing a massive amount of additional damage to your party when you're playing with friends online or crew that you're running with. I'm really, really excited to see how Grim Ward is going to work here. I also like that it has a synergy with Find Potion. If it's good enough, I guess people are going to be maxing Find Potion on Barbarians now. So I guess rather than flipping monsters for loot, you'll get additional rejuve potions out of it. But this is a pretty impactful change. So I'm really excited to see how it actually works in game.
Awesome. And it sounds like not just impactful for the Barb itself, but deeper implications for party play as well.
Yeah, the Barbarian is arguably the best support class in the game. Battle Command getting +1 skills, huge battle orders, being able to taunt and leap to push monsters back. You basically need this guy on any hardcore playthrough, especially when doing Ubers. And Grim Ward being another tool in that package doesn't just mean that you're crowd controlling anymore. It means that you're actively upping the DPS charts. So that's pretty exciting to see that.
Awesome. All right, on combat masteries, tons of changes here. Dev comments, we added Pierce chance to throwing mastery so that Barbarian can better handle groups of enemies with throwing skills. Chance to Pierce added to throwing mastery. What are our deep thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't know how we're going to fit all this into the video, but they've added Pierce to throwing mastery. To actually give some oversight into why that's so important. Being a throw barb is just something you really didn't do. It was kind of okay with perfect gear, and then you had to single target kill monsters. Putting Pierce onto the skill itself means that every time that you throw an axe or a javelin, it has a chance to pass through that monster and continue flying. If you have 100% Pierce, that means every single projectile you put into the air has a chance of hitting tons of monsters, right? If you put them all in a line, theoretically infinite monsters, as long as they're all within radius. This, in addition to, again, some of the rune words that we're going to see a little bit later on, means that you can consistently have 100% Pierce on both of your weapons, and that drastically increases the total clear speed and total DPS output of throwing barbs. So I definitely think that you're going to see a lot of people experimenting with this, because it's kind of like the beloved underdog of Barbarian builds. So I'm ear to ear grinning just thinking about launching 1 million javelins into the ear.
Wonderful. All right, on to the combat skills here. Dev comments, we want to make the leap skills move a lot faster so that they are less awkward to use. Man, especially with the modern graphics looking like Space Jam Slam Dunkin' is hilarious.
Yeah.
Slow-mo.
Every time you start a leap attack, I hear, I believe I can fly. It's ridiculous.
Leap attack is receiving better level scaling to make it a more reliable damage skill to build around. For Berserk, the existing shout synergy is changing to battle orders because the defense loss from the skill contradicts the usage of shout, and this will better connect with other skill synergy build possibilities. Double Throw will now have a baseline damage increase so that it will not purely rely on synergies for damage. Lastly, Frenzy is receiving a new synergy from the lesser used Increased Stamina skill to give more reason to invest skill points there and add new build diversity. So, few things here.
Yeah, so it's a few things. I almost feel like the developer notes, if we didn't have these right here, it would be kind of difficult to understand the changes based off what you're seeing here. I'll touch on Leap and Leap Attack very quickly. Basically, Leap Attack doesn't actually get used as a damaging attack. The build-up for it is just too long. You have to start your Leap animation, end your Leap animation, and then swing at a monster. And since all the monsters are going to be in melee range, you're basically jumping from one dot on the screen to the next one just to attack one time. So I don't think they've made this quite viable yet, but the leap motion being increased itself, Leap and Leap Attack were already fantastic mobility skills. They're one of the only reasons why the Barbarian can speedrun at all, is because you can just jump over everything. And we're seeing almost a doubling of the speed of that. So, like the Assassin, while Leap isn't the same thing as teleporting, it's kind of close. And I think that Mach speed leaping might be one of those things that helps to boost your mobility up and get just like a better quality of life while farming, again, before you have Enigma, or maybe not even having to spec into Enigma on your kit. The changes to Double Throw are really important. Again, Double Throw itself didn't have any damage on the skill. You basically just maxed out Double Swing, which would give you your only damage increase. So it's nice to see that putting points into the skill itself will actually benefit you, and then your plus to skills are also going to up your enhanced damage. Really important. The last part with Frenzy, I get what they're going for here. Increased Stamina is a skill that increases your stamina bar, which stops being relevant around level 5. So the fact that Frenzy is now going to have that duration increase, basically Frenzy, you hit a couple times, you run really, really fast for about 2 or 3 seconds, your duration runs out, and then you have to restart the whole thing over again. But now it looks like Frenzy is going to be a lot more viable, and it's going to feel better piloting that build. So I like what they did. I guess we're maxing out increased stamina, so you can save gold on stamina potions. But yeah, really thoughtful changes here, especially with Berserk. Berserk is a skill that says while you're attacking, you don't have a defense rating. Monsters can't miss you. But it had a synergy that increased your defense. It was like, it was literally throwing points down a hole just to get a synergy bonus. So it's really nice that it swapped over to Battle Orders, which is a skill that you have to max on just about every Barbarian build anyways. So Berserk builds are going to see pretty sizable benefit there as well.
Awesome. I guess before we finish with the Barbarian now, all things taken together, what builds are we seeing emerge as more viable? I guess it's the throw barbs now are hopefully going to be viable builds.
Yeah. So the biggest change is definitely the throw barb. The people like to rag on the Barbarian, saying that's a pretty weak character. The irony of it being that it's the best magic finder in the game, the only gold finder in the game, the best physical build. The Barbarian basically does every physical build better than any other physical build. The changes here are giving us the incentive to actually try out something other than the 3 types of Barbarian that you had before. The Warcry changes are really nice. This also means that you can kind of ride the Warcry train into the later game until you would want to maybe respec into like Whirlwind or now Frenzy or your Pit Zerker, which would use Berserk and have a ton of magic find on it and just walk around and one-shot skeletons. The double throw Barbarian, very, very interesting. I think a lot of people are going to try it out, and it's going to help show that there are a ton of items in this game that were really good. There just wasn't a build to put them onto, and now we have one. And then other than that, everything is just kind of getting tuned a little bit. Your Barbarian's just going to feel a little bit better to pilot. So maybe people are willing to play it in the early game as opposed to, making it your secondary build character like you typically would on the ladder start.
All right, moving on to the Druid here, starting with the elemental skills. Seen a lot of changes. Let's go to the dev notes. With the casting delay changes, Druid fire skills are generally going to be more widely used. Bold statement, we'll find out. In addition, we are increasing the physical damage scaling for fire skills to be a reliable alternative damage source. We felt that Arctic Blast is generally lacking power, so we are increasing the damage scaling, reducing the synergy requirements to free up skill points, and improving the general player controls to allow for smoother free-form targeting. In addition, we wanted to complement the Arctic Blast changes with improvements to Twister to add more build possibilities. Lastly, we are allowing shapeshift forms to cast each of the elemental buff skills to avoid the current hassle of having to change forms to continuously maintain these active buffs. That alone there is a huge quality of life. Now, when it comes to elemental druids, the best is the wind druid, right?
Yes, and I only put that intonation in there, which is that windy druid is by far the most competitive and most probably widely piloted druid build for an elemental skill. Fire has always been this sort of, back alley. Nobody really wants to admit that it's good, but it's because it felt so clunky.
Okay.
And I think to understand this, casting delay was universal. So if I cast Fissure, this one skill, that locks me out of casting any other skill that has a casting delay until a couple seconds later, and then I get to use my next skill. This was across the board, and it's how every skill worked if it had a casting delay. They've made it so that every skill has its own timer. So one of the best examples that I can think about would be for something like the Blizzard Sorceress. Blizzard has a huge casting delay on it. You cast it one time, a couple seconds go by, then you cast your second one. Because of that, Frozen Orb, which also had a casting delay, can't be used during that entire time. With the changes now, you're able to drop a Blizzard, and then the moment that hits, start firing off Frozen Orbs into the same range of monsters, and then once your cooldown comes off, cast Blizzard again. The character with the longest and most casting delays is, in fact, the Druid, and that's why you just would never see people playing the Fire build. Because Firestorm had a casting delay, Molten Boulder had a casting delay, Fissure, Volcano, Armageddon had a casting delay. Hurricane has a casting delay. So if you people would call it like the Avatar Druid, you would cast Armageddon, wait 5 seconds,
Oof.
then you would cast Hurricane, wait 2 seconds, and then you could go play your character. So we just need people to understand like how massive of a change that is to get a better grip on how powerful these builds are about to become.
Would one way to say this be that they're basically removing global cooldowns?
Yeah, I guess you could say it in 3 words, you know? Yeah, I guess I could have said that a lot more simply. No, but absolutely. So global cooldowns have been removed. Skills will have their own cooldown meter, which no longer interact.
Wonderful. That is big. That is big.
So keeping that in mind, looking at these skills again, it looks like they are just increasing the overall damage for just about every fire skill, or at least the ones that were kind of weak. So Molten Boulder, Volcano, and Armageddon. In addition to that, the 3 skills that I just listed, they're all abilities that had a physical damage component to it. So in addition to the massive fire damage that you put out, you were doing some good physical damage as well. And especially with Armageddon, it looks like they're drastically increasing the physical damage portion of it. So when you are farming and you run into your fire immunes, which are really common in hell difficulty, you are still going to be able to put out damage. Whereas before, you basically had to sit there and wait for your mercenary to hopefully be able to kill the monster. So that's another huge quality of life improvement. And when we were first getting these little tidbits of what changes were to come, the first build that hopped to my mind was Fire Druid is going to rise up. And I think you're going to see an entire ladder of Fire Druid flavor of the week.
Amazing. Wonderful.
The other changes here, they're not as grandiose, but they're definitely really interesting. So Arctic Blast is a skill that nobody ever uses. It's a bad skill. You would lock onto a monster, a few seconds would go by, you would start casting very slow moving cold missiles at them. They would move out of the way, and then once they died, you would stop casting, and then you would have to do this whole rev up again. I don't think that they've given this skill enough to really make you want to use it, but at least in the earlier level, where having like a good consistent cold damage output is a lot more impactful, I think it'll help out in early game leveling. And then being able to cast your elemental skills while in werewolf or werebear form is also a really nice quality of life improvement. Like I was saying earlier, everything had a cooldown, so you would cast Armageddon, and you would cast Hurricane, and then you would cast Cyclone Armor, and then you would shift into a werewolf, and then you would run in, depending on how you were building it, obviously. But now you get to do it right there. We were really close to getting teleport while in transformed. I know a lot of people have been asking for that, but it doesn't look like we're getting that just yet. But keep bugging them. Hopefully we'll get it at some point. And then Twister. Twister is a skill you just don't use. I'm not going to bore people with the mechanics, but basically you can't hit people with as many Twisters as you can cast because of how the game works. But now Twister is going to see an increased damage there, and also getting an increase to that stun duration makes it a lot more viable for a CC option, as opposed to only casting Tornado. So it's nice to see them, experimenting around with a little changes here and there to try to incentivize people to try out the lesser used skills.
All right, on to the Shapeshifting. We'll go straight to the dev comments. Werewolf skills are receiving attack rating improvements to help melee gameplay. For Fire Claws, we wanted to reduce the heavy skill point synergy cost to open more build possibilities. Werebear skills are receiving damage improvements to make them more viable for higher difficulties. My first level 90 plus character was a werewolf, and I believe it was a fury werewolf, or I forget exactly, it was so long ago. But my very next character was a Hammerdin, and you can imagine the difference I felt.
Yeah, the whiplash. You go, wait a minute, you can kill monsters quickly? You can move and attack? What is this?
So
yeah, shout out. I mean, when LOD dropped, shout out to everybody who wanted to just be a cool werewolf, and then they transformed and they started swinging, and it felt like they were literally running through like frozen molasses. I felt that pain with you too. So it's nice to see more love coming to the werewolves out there.
Do we think it's enough though?
Yeah. So werewolf and werebear, they already perform well. They're very specialized builds, and they need a lot of good gear, and you need to have a really deep understanding of the game mechanics to understand why you're wearing the gear that you do. I think that these changes just nice kind of buffs to them. Again, you get to cast your elemental skills. That's also helping out, shape-shifting dreams there. The big changes that I think are important to touch on here. Shockwave. Shockwave is basically just a CC. It stuns everything in front of you. If you were to max out Shockwave, have like a level 50 skill cap on Shockwave, it does about 1,000 damage. And that's with the best gear you could possibly put on it. So it's nice to see a little bit of a damage boost there. I don't think it's going to completely change it, but your support werebearers running around there are going to feel a bit better, especially if they're, running Travancore and just letting their mercenary kill stuff. The Maul changes. It's also really nice to see just like melee werebear feel better, be able to hit more consistently, and actually know how long that stun is going to apply for. This is also a little bit of a slight buff to anybody who is going to transform into a werewolf or a werebear. So, you have your enchant sorceress, you have your werewolf barbarian. These benefits are going to apply to all the skills that you get when you transform as well. So that's kind of like a slight buff to other builds. The big thing here is Fire Claws. Now, I assume most people have never seen a Fire Claws Druid, and I'll try to explain why. Fire Claws used to receive synergies from Firestorm, Molten Boulder, Fissure, and Volcano. That would be 80 points in an elemental tree you couldn't use because you can't cast these spells while transformed into a werebear.
Oh, right.
If you want to talk about a clunky build, you used to transform into a human, teleport forward, cast Fissure, wait for that cooldown, transform into a werebear, then attack with Fire Claws, and then transform back into a human, teleport again, ad nauseum. The fact that they are removing 40 skill points worth of synergies here and just putting that damage straight onto the skill means that you have a lot more points to invest in the shapeshifting tree itself. So you're going to be a stronger bear, you're going to have more life, you're going to have more damage on skill, and then on top of that, you're still able to dump points into the elemental build just to get those synergies. So I think that's probably enough to warrant people testing out Fire Claws and playing around with the build. I don't think everything is perfect for it yet, but you're much more incentivized to be in werebear form for longer and just smacking people with your Fire Claws. So that's going to be entertaining to see.
And that takes us to the summoning skills. Few changes over here as well. Quite a big number, actually. So the dev comments, there are plenty of druid summons that could be improved to better build around. In general, all summons will no longer have hidden randomized health values so that the tooltip is more accurate and so summons perform more consistently. Ravens are getting significant changes to help them function as a spell-like skill for summoning druids to use, and this includes damage scaling buffs and new synergies from other summons to fuel their damage. Wolves are getting improvements to give them more of an identity as damage-dealing summons. The spirit summons are receiving a physical damage resist across each difficulty to make them survive more consistently. Spirit of Barbs is receiving changes to thorns to make it a more reliable source of damage. Lastly, each of the creeper summons are receiving improvements to give more reason to invest skill points and to have them perform better at higher levels. So a lot to digest here. What are we thinking about these? Is there anything in particular here that is especially noteworthy?
Yeah, so this is incredibly wordy. Luckily, we are able to boil this down to a few key takeaways. Just very quickly, this is probably one of my least favorite changes. Not a lot of people know this, but your spirit, so your Oak Sage, your Heart of the Wolverine, were just immune to physical damage if you were in Nightmare difficulty. It was one of those very fun little, Easter egg nuggets to drop on people, but they were completely immune. Now they're not. Pretty sad to see it. That literally doesn't affect anyone, but we don't get to bandy around that cool little Easter egg there. What's really important to take away here? One, summons are going to be more consistent. Just to quickly touch on that, basically your wolves used to have a range of health that they would summon at. So if you got a minimum roll on health, they'd get one shot. If you got a maximum roll on health, it seemed like they were just surviving stuff they used to not survive. So on top of them being around for longer, it's going to be a lot more intuitive what's happening on the screen. Like, why is it that they die sometimes? That question's completely removed. They're getting better damage scaling. They're getting a cold damage effect on Spirit Wolf. just to very quickly touch on it, you can only have either your Spirit Wolves or your Dire Wolves or your Grizzly out. You can't have them all, which is one of the major things that stops the dream of a Summon Druid. I don't think any of the changes here are actually strong enough to warrant creating a strict Summon Druid build, or at least it's not going to perform very well. But they are making some aggressive changes that says, hey, we're looking into this to try to figure out a way to make it. Namely, Ravens are getting a massive synergy bonus. They're actually going to have synergies with all of the rest of the summons that you have. So maybe you are summoning a massive flock of Ravens while your Grizzly's out there attacking, or if there's a lot of monsters, you summon your Spirit Wolves that they're applying cold damage and keeping you safe. It opens up a couple build pathways. Everything else is just going to feel slightly better. Poison Creeper is really the only vine that you use, and that's going to have a synergy bonus with Rabies now. So that kind of helps to, maybe you want to build a Rabies Druid and you want to have a little bit extra, area of effect damage. Now your Poison Creeper is out there. It just doesn't all fit right, but at least you're going to feel better by investing points in these things. Very typically, you'd see like 1 or 2 point wonders, either getting a Grizzly or getting your Oak Sage, and Heart of the Wolverine in some circumstances. They touch on something here which is going to be impactful for other classes that we're going to discuss, and that's namely the Spirit of the Barbs. Number 2, your aura no longer returns a percentage of damage when you get hit. It's now going to return flat damage if you are attacked. So Thorns builds aren't really a thing, sadly, in Diablo 2. I am one of the only people who does the pacifist speedrun where you beat the game by having things hit you. So I have a lot of history with this, and it looks like they're making some big changes here, which might actually make them a lot more viable. So if a monster swings at you, they're taking back a flat amount of damage regardless of how much damage you took, or even if the attack hits. And that's a pretty big change overall to how the mechanics work. And I'm interested to see if people are going to be, playing around a little bit, having a Spirit of Barbs out instead of your Oak Sage, just to try to increase your DPS, especially since that Spirit of the Barbs is applying this aura to all your summons. So now while they're tanking for you, monsters are doing damage to themselves, and it's whether or not they hit. So that might be enough to push it over. We'll definitely have to test out just like what these damage numbers look like, but they are pushing hard for a Summon Druid here, and I'm definitely on board for it.
I guess to sum up the Druid overall now, when we talk about the best builds in Diablo 2, I feel as though Druid isn't something that gets mentioned a lot. Do you feel that with these changes we're seeing enough to make more Druid builds be included in the top builds of the game?
Yeah, so your intuition there is correct, right? For people who are really deep into playing Druid and analyze the meta a lot, Druids were always kind of good enough. They have a couple niches that they fall into. They have interesting damage combinations. They have some of the best survivability skills in the game, but these things don't turn into loot dropping on the floor. With the changes that we're seeing here, Druids are just going to see probably a big boost in popularity across the board, but I really do think that, Fire Druid, I think, is going to be S tier for density clear. Your melee Druids are probably going to bump up to A tier, maybe S tier, if you're looking at something like Uber farming, depending on just how impactful these changes are. Summon Druid might actually make it onto a tier list, which even if it just came in, at D tier, that would be amazing, because we just really haven't been able to play that build. There's a whole skill tree you just can't use, and now maybe it's viable. I'll keep myself to a half measure possible there, but yeah, the Druid. I think the Druid's going to be in a lot more conversations outside of like super niche comparison points. I think you're definitely going to see a lot more respect thrown on their name.
Wonderful. All right. On to the Necromancer, starting with the summoning skills. Only a couple changes here, and the dev comments are almost as long as the changes. We saw a good opportunity to improve lesser used summons for the Necro. Skeletal mages have received significant damage scaling improvements so that their elemental damage values are more consistent. This means that cold damage is more effective, but still slightly weaker than fire damage because of its chill utility, and poison damage is much more reliable with a fixed duration and better damage scaling. Blood Golem and Fire Golem are receiving damage improvements to make them more competitive with the other golems. For Iron Golem, we are changing the Thorns aura to deal more reliable damage to improve its source of effectiveness. See Paladin changes below for more details. Now, as we dive into this, do you want to talk a bit about how, I guess, the meta with Skeletal Mage has been working with regards to what mages you end up getting?
Yeah, so Skeletal Mage is probably my least favorite skill in Diablo 2. So I'm sorry if a lot of shade comes through my analysis here. The problem with Skeleton Mage is the problem with skeletons in general. So if people don't know, your Skeleton Mage can basically only attack once per second. All of your summons have a really long delay before they can take their actions. So you'd summon a Skeleton Mage, it would fire off a charged bolt, it would sit around for a second, the monster would move out of the way, it wouldn't get hit, then your skeleton tries to run away from it, and then it fires off another charge bolt. And it's been 5 or 6 seconds and you haven't actually hit any monsters yet. On top of that, what skeletons you have is completely random. So if you're farming in an area with a lot of cold immunes, all of your cold skelly mages don't do damage. So you have to individually unsummon them and then summon another one and hope that you get a good one, but you never get the good one, so you have to unsummon it again. And I could go on and on. But basically, skeleton mages were so finicky, so frail, dealt so little damage that they basically weren't really useful in any way, shape, or form. Now, that doesn't stop people from summoning them, because you have to put a point into it to get down to revive anyways. And with your massive amount of plus to skills on a summoner, you're going to be able to summon 10 skelly mages, so you might as well have them. And at that point, if you don't care about them, they can be whatever damage you want. Now that I'm done haranguing skeleton mage, there is an upside here. They are pretty drastically increasing both their survivability and their total damage output. And on top of that, there's 2 really big changes here. One, poison damage is going to have a consistent 4-second length. Before, it would continue to scale up and up and up. And basically, the longer your poison takes to deal damage, the less damage per second you're doing. But now it's going to be more consistent, so that damage output is higher, cold damage output is higher, and lightning damage output is higher. You'll see that they haven't increased the Fire Skelly Mage because they were kind of already in a good place. It was everything else that was really lackluster. And after messing around with the build a little bit, I don't think that all of a sudden you're going to do a pure Skelly Mage, build, forego regular skeletons and forego revives. But you're going to be rewarded more for taking the time to summon them. And if you want to be that nitpicky where you unsummon them until you get the perfect one every time, I recommend lightning, while you have 1 poison and 1 cold. So you get the benefits of the poison, you get the benefits of the chill duration, and then you get the highest damage output with lightning. That's a free pro tip there for you.
Wonderful.
And then just to summarize all of this together, you're not really going to see a difference in the meta, I don't think. Blood Golem is actually used, especially in much lower levels, just to be able to cheese bosses because it has such a huge life pool. But you're really not going to use this in the end game. Iron Golem is already, top tier, so it's either number 1 or number 2 best Golem. The changes to the Thorns damage isn't really impactful here. You basically don't want your Iron Golem to get hit because it's probably walking around as an insight. So you basically want to keep it out of harm's way as much as possible. And sadly, there's nothing you can really do to Fire Golem to make it worth using. But it having a damage increase means that people who are experimenting around with it are going to get a little bit more out of it. So that's at least nice. All in all, I think the summon, basically the Necromancer across the board, is seeing the least amount of changes because it's arguably the strongest character in the game. And the changes that they have made are helping you to reward playing something other than just running around as a poison Necromancer blowing up the entire screen. So it's exciting to see that.
That's good. That's good. Speaking of poison, onto the poison and bone skills. Not too many changes here, but the dev comment saying bone skills are generally well performing, but we saw an opportunity to improve synergy bonuses to better scale in the late game and to make their heavy skill point investment more valuable. Additionally, bone armor, are we going to put more than 1 point into bone armor now? Is receiving better damage absorb scaling to make it more rewarding to spend points on the skill itself instead of relying too heavily on its synergies. So what do we think here?
Yeah, so really concise. They're making Bone Spear a little bit stronger, right? So you're gaining an additional 20% damage per synergy, basically an 80% damage increase across the board. Bone Spear is the other build that is 100 plus points to get all the synergies maxed out. So it's just nice to see a little bit extra damage on that kit, because it typically falls off in the late game. Even though it has like one of the highest plus to skills you can get across the board, its damage didn't keep scaling well, so inevitably it falls off. Yeah, they changed bone armor too, so this was the second kind of fun thing to tell people, which was bone armor. It was actually better to put points into the synergies than bone armor itself. So it looks like they just normalized that, so you're going to get the same benefit of putting points into the skill as you would for the synergies.
Oh, it's just normalized. It's not better to put into the skill? I thought if they're going to make a change, they should make it better to put into the base skill.
So if the numbers are the same, if all they changed is bone armor itself, it now looks like you're getting 15 points per skill in bone armor and 50 points per synergy. So maybe they didn't include it here, but at least now it's equal rather than only dumping points into the synergy.
I guess that's an improvement, but I mean, that means we still might just see 1 point in bone armor, right?
Oh, yeah. So, and sorry to crush everybody's dreams of maxing out bone armor. Bone armor is going to continue to be a 1 point wonder, and this gets a bit more into like why the meta is the way that it is. If you're going to be a bone necro and you're putting points into Bone Spear doesn't have a synergy with bone armor, but it does have a synergy with Bone Prison and Bone Spirit. So you're still not really incentivized to put any points into bone armor other than the prereq that you need to get down to the other synergies. It does mean though that builds, so your poison necro, your summoner, these are going to get a better benefit out of plus to skills by putting that 1 point into bone armor. So it's still good across the board, but it's not really going to change how you allocate your skills at all.
All right, on to curses here. Dev comments, for the weakened skill, we added new damage reduction scaling to give more reason to spend additional points on the skill and to give it a more powerful identity.
They have succeeded in that, and that the skill will be stronger. The thing, most curses for the Necromancer just increase radius and duration when you put points into them, and it doesn't actually increase the effect. One of the big, the most notable one is lower res, gets stronger the more points that you put into it. Weaken, increasing how much total damage it's going to reduce is probably an attempt to separate it from the much stronger skill of Decrepify, which also reduces damage, but also applies a slow and also increases damage that the monster takes. I don't think this is enough to really warrant putting points into Weaken, but it's really nice for some more challenging playthroughs. So your hardcore players are going to get a bigger benefit out of this. Anybody playing, single player or solo self-found will get a bigger benefit out of this until they can eventually skill into Decrepify. So it's nice. This is, if I were to do a read on this, the problem with Necromancer curses is that they're all incredibly powerful and you only need to put 1 point into most of them. And messing around a little bit with scaling on Weaken is probably the safest route to begin doing analysis on. Is there a way for us to scale up the other curses without making them ridiculously powerful? So if I were to take a read on this, I think this is them testing the waters a little bit.
I would add that I guess one of the perhaps key design issues is that you could only have one curse on an enemy at a time, right?
Yep, absolutely. And that also overrides like Barbarian shouts and some other abilities in the game too. So it's a very challenging design space to work inside of.
All right, moving on to the Paladin here. Defensive auras, I guess it's just tooltips. We added more information to tooltips. Yep, so that's it, just tooltips, which is great.
Yeah, they sure did summarize that very well. I can give a little bit of wisdom here, which is they're making the game more accessible and more intuitive to your new player base. There was no way for you to know that putting points into resist fire gained you 0.5 maximum resistance per hardpoint. But me saying that out loud, most people playing the game wouldn't even know what I'm talking about unless they already knew this little secret. So it's nice that they're giving the power to the player base and helping people to learn the systems on their own rather than beating them over the head with it. So
absolutely agreed. Yeah. All right. On to the offensive auras. We're seeing some more changes here, including the Thorns one. Lots of dev comments. We wanted to add more potential to the area of effect damage auras, since they are a capable way for the Paladin to handle groups of monsters. By increasing damage based on distance to the caster, each AoE damage aura will have increased effectiveness while still maintaining the same cadence of visual effects on the screen. Also, we saw that Holy Fire should scale better at higher skill levels to be consistent with general fire damage power compared to the other elements. For Thorns, we want to improve the gameplay around getting hit to deal damage, so we are making the skill deal flat damage based on attack attempts rather than returning damage after getting hit. This will allow Thorns to have a more consistent combat performance instead of unpredictable and riskier results. So a lot to digest here. The first thing was, is this new that damage increases based on distance to the caster? Was that in the game before, or is this completely new?
This is completely new, and I believe this is the only instance that we see across the changes where positioning is now directly affecting your DPS in a tangible way. It's rewarding people for running these auras and getting in close, i.e. your Zealers, your Charge Paladins. I think the important thing to note is that this is also going to, increase the damage output of any Mercenary that has one of these auras on.
Right.
And there are a ton of builds that use like the Dual Dream setup, which gives you this really powerful Holy Shock aura. So those people were using it just to get a high elemental damage on their melee attack. But now, since they're in melee range, this ticking aura is also going to increase and be more beneficial. So on top of the Paladin, having that better Holy Fire aura, and the more places that we're going to farm, hopefully you can actually farm somewhere on a Fire Zealer or a Fire Charge Paladin. This is a very, very interesting change. And I think this is another place where they're getting the opportunity to test the waters with basically increasing the dynamic nature of combat in Diablo 2. There is no other skill that cares about distance as far as like your total damage output. And testing it out here gives us an opportunity of where else could your positioning and you being thoughtful about the battlefield as a whole, rather than just left clicking on a monster until it dies, is very, very cool.
Definitely opens up some interesting design possibilities. Yeah. All right. And then I guess the Thorns is the next big change here.
Yeah. So, and here's where I get a little bit afraid that maybe we're correcting a little bit too hard. So I'll try to give some context. That Thorns used to say return a percentage of damage back to the monster. So if I return 100% damage, if something hits me for 50 damage, I'm doing 100 damage. The Paladin had the strongest Thorns, like the strongest Thorns ability in the game, and you would get into the multiple thousands of percent damage returned, which is pretty noticeable. Not good enough to make a build around it, but definitely palpable. The fact that they're swapping over to a flat damage effect means that the more damage you're putting yourself into, you're not getting a higher reward out of it. So it really comes down to exactly what the numbers look like. But again, they're making it so that you don't actually have to get hit. Before you had to get hit, a monster actually had to hit you. So basically, you didn't want to dodge, you didn't want high defense, you didn't want to have a shield on. But now you can fully stack your defense, you can go max block, you can get whatever dodge sources that you want, and then still have this aura up and increase damage output. It's interesting. It's a fine balancing act to figure out, like, are we kneecapping it or are we finally enabling it to actually be a thing? But I would say Thorns is still probably going to be regulated to possibly a support aura that you would throw up in case you have a couple other Paladins in the game and you already have Salvation up and you already have Conviction up. Maybe you also throw a Thorns in there, just kind of increase damage output.
Now, just to clarify on Thorns, is it only applicable when you are hit with an attack and not with a spell?
Yes, and it's only melee attacks.
Ooh.
So, yeah, a monster has to walk up and actually punch you in the face for Thorns damage to work. They shoot you with a bow, that doesn't count. If they cast a spell on top of you, that doesn't count. If they look at you mean, that doesn't count. They have to actually walk up and hit you, which means that there are literally just some monsters in the game that cannot have thorns damage applied to them ever. So you can't just walk around and kill everything with it. And this is like especially noticeable when you get into the later game. Into Chaos Sanctuary, there's a ton of Oblivion Knights that just cast spells the whole time. None of them get affected. So that's one of the major issues with thorns as it is right now. The verbiage when the target is attacked might open up at least, like archers and people using ranged attacks, maybe. So we'll have to test that out. But yeah, it's not great.
That's fair. All right. That takes us to the combat skills. A number of changes here. Dev comments, we wanted to improve the lesser used combat skills to give more viable build options. Holy Bolt will now pierce to increase its combat use cases and will have less skill point synergy investment to open more possibilities to spend skill points elsewhere. Fist of the Heavens is also getting the same Holy Bolt pierce changes and will now have less casting delay and improved controls to help make it a more effective level 30 skill to use. What are our thoughts here?
This is probably the biggest change for the Paladin that I think should excite the most people. I'm going to rattle off some numbers right now. If you were to build a Holy Bolt Fist of Heavens Paladin, your Holy Bolt damage before any changes without this damage increase is doing 18,000 magic damage per cast. And now it is going to pierce and not get stopped by your Mercenary. There's a lot of nuance to how this works, but basically it only hits undead. And if it hits your Mercenary or a buddy of yours, it won't do any damage to any monsters around you. Now it's piercing through every single target that you hit. And this also applies to your Fist of Heavens, because when you cast Fist of Heavens, it drops Holy Bolts. I think this build as a PVM model, because Fist of Heavens is already used in PvP, but it felt clunky there. There was a lot of things that made it really difficult to pilot, had a really long delay. This increase in damage, piercing targets, removing synergies from Blessed Hammer so that you can skill into other things more easily, and drastically reducing the casting delay on Fist of Heavens means that I realistically think that we finally have a second spellcaster Paladin build, and you're not only going to build hammers.
Amazing.
Now it's more specialized, it's more niche, but think about this. The Chaos Sanctuary, probably like the most iconic farming area for Blessed Hammer Paladin. More than 2/3 of the monsters in there are all undead. And then for everything that isn't undead, you have Fist of Heavens, which is this massive single target lightning damage that also does AoE damage to undead. So you're going to walk in there, basically keep your Mercenary alive forever because Holy Bolt's going to heal him or her, whichever option that you pick. And then on top of that, you're going to be mowing down these undead, and the more density, the better. You're basically not getting into a more dangerous situation by there being more density. You're only increasing your DPS. I want to liken this a little bit to something like the Lightning Fury Amazon, who she throws one projectile, it obliterates the screen, she walks forward, she does it again. It's not going to be that impactful, but you're finally going to be able to cast at range, not need to telestomp onto things and start casting hammers and getting, like block locked, just blocking a million times while you're trying to cast your hammers. It's a really, really cool change. I'm really excited to try this out. And again, I keep touching on it. With the increase in places that you're going to be able to farm now, there are a ton of great areas in the game that are mostly undead. And then again, you have Fist of Heavens for everything else. So I'm really, really excited for this build to finally be able to shine.
So I guess looking at the Paladin as a whole here, we're probably not seeing too many changes, at least to the meta, apart from potentially this being another, I guess, S-tier Paladin build with the Holy Bolt Fist of the Heavens.
Yeah, so you're seeing a little bit more of an incentive to try out some of the elemental melee builds, which is definitely very nice. You're going to just perform better if you have any of those auras up, which is just like free icing on the cake. And then we have this one whole new build. But if you look at these changes, you'll see that a lot of things went untouched because everybody knows that Paladin is top tier everything. The Paladin can do everything. So it's nice that they still had some places to grow into and to experiment with these redesigns for the lesser used abilities.
Absolutely. All right, and I think that takes us to the last class, the Sorceress, another one that is a high performer class. Under cold skills, we're seeing a number of probably smaller changes here. Dev comments, with the cold armor skills, we want to further diversify them by ensuring that each has distinct advantages. After these changes, chilling armor will have the greatest defense bonus and damage potential, while still only triggering on ranged attacks. Also, Frost Nova is receiving damage scaling improvements to give it more power where it was lacking in the later game.
Yeah, so again, there's not a lot to touch here. The changes to casting delay, the example that I gave before, Blizzard and Frozen Orb, you're going to be able to pilot like pure cold builds, but also your hybrid builds a lot better. You know, a lot of people play Meteor, right? So Frozen Orb plus Meteor. No casting delays between them means you're just basically doubling your total APM there and being able to better control the screen of monsters in front of you. So that's really nice. As a weird tangent, I'm currently working on a project where I beat the game on hell difficulty on a sorceress without attacking. And it's using all of these armor abilities.
Oh.
So me personally, it's really nice to see damage increase across the board here. But the problem is that frozen armor is a 1-point wonder. You put it on, if something hits you, it gets frozen. There's almost no reason to use shiver armor and chilling armor, even though these abilities would technically increase your total damage output. It's just not that impactful. So that's why you're seeing these like pretty massive synergy bonuses here. And maybe there's a reason to use them in the PVM space. Time will tell. I'm a little hesitant to say that you'll actually see that. And then the other thing here, which is it's small, but it's interesting. Frost Nova is also just a 1-point wonder. It's a nice CC ability. You have an AoE slow effect. And the fact that we're seeing damage scale increase on there might warrant playing around with using Frost Nova maybe as a secondary damage option on something like your Frozen Orb or your Blizzard Sorceress, rather than just having it as a 1-point wonder. So it's interesting to see just how far they try to push damage on something like Frost Nova, but nothing too much here. The Sorceress is in a great place, and I think that we're going to see some much more interesting changes once we get to the other trees.
All right, speaking of, we got lightning skills here, only a couple changes, but the dev comments, we saw an opportunity to add new synergies for lesser used lightning skills to increase their damage potential and create new skill build possibilities. What are our thoughts here?
You can go ahead and put a bet on this. I will stake my entire reputation on it. Nova Sorceress is going to be the best, most played Sorceress class in patch 2.4.
Whoa.
Yeah, no, big statement. Nova Sorceress, way back in the day, was one of the strongest builds, and it's what everybody played. Why did they do that? Because you would max out Static Field, you would max out Nova, you would max out Thunderstorm, you'd max out Energy Shield. You'd show up to your screen, you'd have a 32-yard radius on your static. What does that mean? It hits the entire screen. You static everything down, and then you teleport, cast 1 Nova, blow up a pack. Teleport, cast 1 Nova, blow up a pack. They then had the audacity in patch 2.4 to add a synergy bonus onto Nova, which previously didn't have any synergies at all. And then on top of that are buffing Thunderstorm. While the changes to Thunderstorm, Thunderstorm's great. It's very flashy, literally, no pun intended. But it's just okay. It drops a lightning bolt onto a monster every couple of seconds. It's kind of like, whatever. But this change to Nova is going to be massive. Nova is already a great skill. The problem being that it doesn't really scale well with players' settings. But since it's now going to have a static field synergy, you're going to be maxing out static field. We get to play like we used to. You teleport onto a screen, you static the entire screen down. Everything is just about dead, and then you show up and you one-shot them with a single Nova. I realistically think it's probably going to be the most played build. The only thing that will stop it from being the most played build is that it relies very heavily on having infinity. Every Sorceress build wants infinity, but Lightning in particular needs to have infinity. You need to be able to break your res so that the rest of your minus enemy resistance on your gear can actually apply. But once you have that, you're just going to annihilate.
It's a bit more expensive to get that together, but nonetheless, I mean, that's a problem that a lot of the Sorceress builds have to deal with regardless. I'll give you an out here that just in case there's any changes to the patch notes before the patch goes live.
Oh, sure. Yes. let's throw that caveat in there.
Yeah.
Let's get that back in on the tape. If the changes stay the same, I think that Nova will be the most competitive and strongest Sorceress build in patch 2.4. There we go.
All right. And that takes us to the fire skills. We're seeing a few changes here with a lot of dev comments who wanted to improve the lesser used fire skills and give more reasons to use them. Inferno is receiving player control improvements with freeform casting like Arctic Blast and better damage scaling. Blaze is an often ignored skill, so we wanted to free up synergy requirements and provide more utility and power with damage increases and a new run-walk speed buff for extra utility. Lastly, with Hydra, we wanted to improve the gameplay of summoning Hydras to make it easier to skill in combat situations. The removal of casting delay and the new limitation on max Hydras will match the max Hydra count achievable from before the changes, but now players will have a much easier time to summon that amount. So are we going to see a viable or even a really good Hydra build now?
I think so, yeah. In all honesty, Hydra right now is probably like C or D tier, like very specifically for farming bosses. You dropped a bunch of Hydras, you're using your Mephisto moat trick, you drop a bunch of Hydras on top of him, and then you throw fireballs at him until he dies. It was okay. The damage increase here in the casting delay removal, I think again is touching on that concept that I was talking about before, which is the dynamic positioning on the map. Since I can, at max FCR, drop all my Hydras, reposition, start attacking with Fireball, reposition again, drop new Hydras as monsters are shifting around the field, is going to make piloting that feel a lot better and just generally increase your rev up to max DPS. Because before, you'd cast your Hydra, you wait for your delay, hope the monsters didn't move, cast your next one, etc., etc. I definitely think that Hydra is going to bump up. I don't know if it's enough to make it like a pure Hydra build to just be absolutely what you play. It is an 80-point build with mastery synergies in the skill itself, so you have enough wiggle room to be able to spec into something else, but it definitely makes dual element builds feel better for using Hydra. I think, again, Inferno, it's just like Arctic Blast. You're really still not going to use it. You're definitely not going to use it in the late game, but it's nice that they're experimenting with it and pushing it further. The Blaze change, I think, is a very interesting design space for them to walk into. Blaze makes you run faster on a character that has innate teleport.
That's true.
So what's the point of running faster on Blaze? One, it'll make the early game feel a little bit better. I'm not sure that it's going to like warrant legitimately speccing into it, but there's a little set of boots named Inferno Stride. And Inferno Stride say chance to cast Blaze when struck. And then on top of that, the Sorceress specific Rune Word armor, Enlightenment. So every class has a Rune Word armor that gives you +2 to skills and then a couple chance to cast abilities and some other stats. That also has Blaze when struck. So rocking those two things, maybe have a couple points into Blaze. So while you are playing, every once in a while, you're getting this little bit of a speed boost. I think, and this is going to be a little bit of a stretch, but this feels very much like Diablo 3 to me. Which is like, you have these skills, you have these mobility skills that are built into your total kit, and you have these effects that are going off. It has a chance to do it. You have pretty good uptime of it. And you're getting a little bit of that quality of life, a little better mobility, a little faster clear speed. And, anybody can put on those boots. So now you're going to see, a bunch of people running real fast while a giant wake of fire erupts behind them.
Okay, so I guess that wraps up the classes. Onto mercenaries. I guess we'll hit upon the dev comments a lot here. So the general intent with the mercenaries overall is to make more than just the Act 2 mercenary viable. So let's see, what are they doing to the Act 1 mercenary? The dev comments. Rogue Archer is getting new flavored ranged skills that will scale as she levels up. These new skills should improve her AoE damage effectiveness and thus make her a more effective ranged damage dealer. And actually, before we continue here, I'll make a note, and I'm sure you can explain this better, that the mercenary bug trick no longer works. Do you want to explain the ramifications of that?
Sure. So for people who don't know, basically, if you could manage to get your mercenary stuck in an area, like stuck in a corner or stuck on a wall or stuck behind a door for the Act 2 mercenary, fun fact, every other mercenary can open up doors, but not Act 2. I don't know what's up with that. But if you could get them stuck and then moved far enough away and waited a few seconds, the game would relocate your mercenary next to you so you wouldn't lose them. And for whatever reason, this made it so that if a monster only had a melee attack, they were invisible. They could not target your mercenary. They could still get hit by ranged attacks and AoE, but like Diablo won't take a swing or target your mercenary if they're bugged. They took that out. The ramifications for this, the harder you play and the more that you try to min-max, the more you felt this. So there were a couple builds that kind of couldn't keep their mercenary alive very well, but still wanted to get an aura or still wanted to get their DPS output. So you can bug your merc, and you have to do it at every farming session, every time you walk into a game. But once they're bugged forever until you leave the game. So you could keep the benefits of your mercenary without having good gear on them or not being high enough level to protect them. So the fact that they've removed this functionality makes it so that your mercenary is a lot more vulnerable, and it's a lot harder to keep them alive, especially in the early game where they don't have good gear. The changes, hopefully, they haven't directly addressed it in any way, but this just generally reduced the overall power of mercenaries until you were in the very late game. So any buffs that we see to them here is going to help them still feel effective in the early game, in the mid game, where you need the most help, right? That's before you have your gear, before your build is fully done. So it'll be nice to potentially have stronger mercenaries across the board.
Yeah, I really do hope that they're increasing their survivability enough to, I guess, make up for this or just help keep mercenaries alive more, because they can really become a gold sink very fast to the point that a lot of players don't even bother with the mercenaries just because it's almost always dead, at least, in the earlier to mid game before you can gear them to a point where they're not constantly dying.
Oh yeah, once they cost 50,000 gold to go and re-recruit and they die 2 or 3 times in a game, that's all your gold right there. So you'd say, well, I had them at level 12. I guess I won't see you again until I'm level 80, bud.
Now, I notice we're not getting a lot of granular details on the changes to the mercenaries, so I imagine a lot of this will have to wait to actually get to play and see their effectiveness. But your thoughts on the updated rogue archer, who's now getting freezing arrow and fire explosion arrow?
The addition of these abilities are something that the rogue archer needed. You really only use the rogue archer on builds that wanted to have fanaticism aura, because you would make the faith bow and you would give it to her. There was no other use case for her across the board. These changes right here, I think, start to get her into that range of competitiveness, especially with freezing arrow. So freezing arrow is going to hit a group. It's going to apply a massive freeze length to everything. Everything that can't be frozen has a massive cold length applied to it, slowing their attack, slowing their movement speed. Before this, your archer just kind of spat out a few arrows and then would cast either cold arrow or fire arrow. And since those don't really scale well, her overall damage output was kind of irrelevant, especially with the new rune words that we're seeing, being able to stack a lot of resistance and pierce on her getting better damage. Also, these skills being buffed for the Amazon means that they're buffed here as well. So I really think that you're going to start seeing DPS models for the rogue archer outside of only walking around to give you the benefits of fanaticism aura. And the rogue archer, the rogue archer, and not to jump ahead, but the Act 3 mercenary are the two that I'm most excited to try out, because I really think that they've opened up the design space in a way that their viability is at least going to be competitive with Act 2 mercenaries, which are kind of the king of the castle right now.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive into the Act 2 mercenary and see what they're doing to him. The comments: the Desert Mercenary is already popular. That's an understatement. But we saw an opportunity to add some quality of life improvements by allowing players to hire all 6 different aura types in Nightmare and Hell difficulty. That's just the quality of life. Rather than having to switch between modes, with the general improvements to Thorns, we wanted to improve the level scaling to make this aura mercenary type more meaningful. So do you think that is something that'll actually happen, or is it really we gotta wait to see what those Thorns numbers are?
I think you can honestly put a nail in the coffin right here. The Act 2 mercenary is so powerful because of all of the other auras that they have available to you. The only place I see you using any other type of mercenary other than Holy Freeze or Might aura, and in some very, very niche circumstances, a Prayer aura mercenary, is if you have a dedicated group of people that you're playing with. Everybody has their mercenary, and there's no reason to have multiples of an aura, so you might as well get the entire bushel. I think the much more important thing here that I'll touch on, because it looks like it's kind of across the board, is that mercenaries are now going to have a normalized stat line. It used to be that if you got a mercenary in normal, they would have better stat scaling once they hit max level, as opposed to getting one from Nightmare or Hell. That's no longer the case. They're going to have the same scaling. And this is actually a pretty good buff for the Desert Mercenary, because you basically could never get a normal difficulty merc because their auras changed per difficulty that you were in. So you always had to use the Nightmare version, which was just slightly weaker. So this is actually a kind of sideways buff to the Act 2 Mercenary. And then on top of that, the quality of life change, where you're going to be able to get all 6 aura types starting in Nightmare, as opposed to having to wait until your character gets to Hell, is also pretty nice. But yeah, I'm sorry. Thorn's Aura just isn't going to be a thing on your merc again, unless you're in that very specific gameplay model where you have a full team.
That is fair. All right, on to Act 3. This was my favorite mercenary, the cold one specifically, before I realized what the game's meta was. But a bunch of changes here. The dev comments, the Iron Wolves are great elemental sorcerers, but we saw they have been underperforming in higher difficulties. We improved their core stats so that they are more in line with other mercenaries, while also having a distinct advantage with having the most resistance values. For skills, we wanted to embrace their elemental fantasies, so we decided to give new flavorful utility skills to further incentivize reasons to want to use these mercenary types. I'm looking at, I guess, cold. What are we getting? Cast Glacial Spike more often, frozen armor scaling, fire damage. What are they doing? Added enchant. Now the Iron Wolf will cast enchant on himself, the player, and nearby allies. So that's interesting. And lightning now has static
a lot to say
field.
about that one.
Okay,
static field.
Yeah. So now it's just lightning. Like, that's the only element that exists for this mercenary, right?
It's so much to unpack here. Yeah, sorry for talking over. It's just this set of changes has me so excited for the first ladder. The problem with the Act 3 mercenary is that it was a wet noodle. It uses a sword, but it doesn't attack with it. It has really low stats, so it's difficult to put gear on it. And it had a couple skills that it would cast, but since it can't do them all consistently, you had these like drastically different performances depending on what the AI decision chose. So without getting into the nitty gritty of all of the stats, it's really cool that as an identity, it now has the highest baseline for resistances. That's very cool. That's like a defining feature that says like this mercenary is theoretically the easiest one to keep alive now, because it can survive the most damage with the least amount of gear. So that's very cool. For cold, casting Glacial Spike more often, that's your AoE freeze ability. It's really nice that their level scaling is going to increase, meaning they're going to get more damage, and that plus skills are going to benefit them more. So cold is cool. Then you get to fire. They now cast enchant. Most endgame builds will use a demon limb, or our endgame melee builds will use a demon limb at the beginning of their farming session just to cast a high level enchant on themselves, and then they put it back into their stash, and then they go do their farming session and then repeat. The fact that you will be able to put as many plus skills and plus to fire damage onto a mercenary gets to wear 4 pieces of armor, so a weapon, a shield, armor, and a helmet. You will absolutely get a busted set of gear, put it onto him, wait till he casts enchant on you, take the gear off, go get your other mercenary, go do your farming session. Enchant has a really long duration, so that's not that ridiculous of a pre-buff regimen. So that's nutso. It also means that this mercenary is going to directly impact the early game progression for melee builds who desperately need attack rating because it's so difficult to hit stuff in this game. So there's a lot of implications there. And then lightning casts static field. That is ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. For people who follow, the speedrunning community, bosses take a very long time to kill, especially when you're very low level and you have bad gear. So crushing blow is incredibly powerful for melee builds. The fact that you can go hire a mercenary, who even if they just show up and cast static field one time before they die, that is chunking the boss for up to 25% of their life with a single cast. You're going to be fighting bosses at 75 max life at a minimum just by having this mercenary. It is absolutely ridiculous. And when they first pointed out, or when they first hinted at the fact that they wanted to add utility skills to these mercenaries. The wheels started turning. The only 2 utility skills is static field and I guess telekinesis, because it knocks back monsters. But there was no way they were going to put that on a mercenary. And so I've just been sitting here like foaming at the mouth, waiting for them to say static field, because this is such a massive game changer.
So right now, is it looking like this might be the best mercenary to have with you all the time?
That's where it gets a little bit dicey. I won't try to sell anybody any smoke here. The Act 2 mercenary is still by and large going to outperform on endgame gear, but what this gives you is options. And on top of that, it gives us more room to experiment, and again, gives us other options in the early and mid game. You walk into Act 3, you're on your normal character, you finish up the Gidbin, you go talk to Ashira, and she gives you an Iron Wolf. And hopefully you get... they all have fantastic names, too. You can go get your Blaze Act 3 mercenary for your Fire Merc. But you get your Lightning mercenary, and all of a sudden, you're kind of a sorceress on any build. You know, like that's really, really impactful. The issue with the Act 3 mercs is, again, what I pointed to is that they don't do any attacks. They kind of run around and then cast spells willy-nilly. So we'll need to see whether or not any changes to their AI are going to make their casting more consistent. But a Lightning Mercenary is absolutely going to perform well, and I do think that it's going to be a best in slot option on certain builds. We'll just kind of have to see what the numbers look like.
That's fair. And that takes us to the Act 5 Barbarian Warrior. Dev comments, we want to give the Barbarian Warrior more identity while still maintaining his Barbarian fantasies. So we decided to give him the Battle Cries skill as a new way for him to debuff enemies, which should prove to be a useful utility for players. In addition, we wanted to increase his life and defense scaling to ensure that he is the tougher mercenary type. What are our thoughts on this one?
Another very cool design space. For people who don't know, Battle Cry is a skill that applies a curse-like effect, so you're going to see a little thing floating over the monster's head, and that's going to decrease their damage, like their total damage output, and decrease their defense. So it's easier for you to hit monsters. Less defense that they have, the easier it is to hit. So this is another circumstance where we're getting a mercenary that is going to actively increase the consistency for your melee builds, which are definitely like the most impoverished builds in the early game. You need good gear and you need good rune words, and you don't have either of those when you walk into Nightmare. So this is a really cool place for them to go to. The fact that Bash and Stun are going to continue to scale is also really nice. The Act 5 Mercenary pumps out a ton of damage. You don't see it in game, but every time they attack, they actually do a double attack. So it's really nice to see that their skills that they use, which are singular attacks, are going to get better scaling. They now have the most life and the most defense, so they're theoretically, the hardiest as far as taking physical damage and tanking for you, which is really where they excel. I think they hit on all of the fantasy of the Barbarian and are also making them legitimately viable options for builds that struggle a bit more. So everything that isn't a sorceress is probably going to benefit from this. There's been a general outcry from the community at large saying that it would be nice if they either cast Battle Command or Battle Orders, basically to reduce reliance on something like Call to Arms, which basically every build needs to use in the late game. I personally think that would be going too far, but Battle Cry is definitely a great first step. Give you a reason to use this mercenary other than the only reason why I use it right now. You put a Lawbringer on him, so it's a rune word that's going to have a Sanctuary aura, and then they also applied Decrepify. So this is giving you more reasons to use this mercenary in general, and I like that. I'd like to see them go a little bit further with it. But I think right now it's already fairly competitive. I'd say this is like third best, just outside of obviously Act 2, which is just, it's going to be king until they remove something from it. And then I think the changes for Act 3 are pretty comparable to this.
All right. Well, it's definitely a step in the right direction for the mercenaries. Moving on to rune word changes. So Insight apparently now can be put on bows and crossbows. Insight is a rune word that you often want to give you that mana regen from the meditation aura, right? So I guess they wanted to ensure that the Act 1 mercenaries can also now carry Insight. I guess that's the decision here.
That is bonkers. That is so cool. Yeah, so, every single person basically puts an Insight onto an Act 2 mercenary. But now you get to put it onto your Act 1 mercenary. It's going to be casting Freezing Arrow for you, giving you mana. This is a very, very cool change. I think the implications here are pretty significant. Insight is actually a very, very powerful rune word for the runes that you put into it. I think this is like a legitimately good starter bow on Boazons. You get crit strike, you get really high enhanced damage, you actually get faster cast rate, big bonus to your attack rating, big magic find.
Awesome. And then we have a number of new rune words quickly here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 new rune words. We'll look at the dev comments. For new rune words, we focused on complementing the skill and mercenary changes seen above, along with giving underused runes more usage. Plague and pattern rune words previously existed in data, but were never enabled. Yeah, these have been data mined for years and years. So we made some additional tweaks, and they are finally now available to be used in game. So
all these rune words are pretty cool. We start with the classics, Plague and Pattern, which have been in the game files, although they have been updated, so it's really nice. Plague is basically like baby's first Death's Web, so this is now an option to get poison necros off the ground a bit sooner. Chance to cast lower resist when struck means you get to put it onto an Act 5 or an Act 3 Mercenary, and then when they get hit, you get the benefits of lower res, so it's also like a kind of janky version of Infinity for much cheaper. The fact that it rolls up to +2 skills, so it is bound to a sword. Your Necromancer can still use that. You can put it onto a Rabies Druid to start off with. Cleansing Aura is going to be really nice, and you're probably going to have to put this onto at least one Mercenary if you're playing through on hardcore. Just a solid weapon all around, and I think it's a really nice stopgap for a lot of endgame build. Pattern, another rune word that's absolutely fantastic. It's only built in claws, so this is for your assassins, but the most notable change is that it used to have block chance, and now it has faster block rate. The reason why that's so important is because weapon block, the ability to block if you're dual wielding claws, actually didn't benefit from block chance, but it does benefit from faster block rate. So if you're dual wielding these and a nice set of claws that have a good amount of staff mods in them, you're getting 30 all res, and also you're going to have the second fastest block speed in the game, comparable to like a Holy Shield Paladin. So while the stats on it aren't super stellar, they're very nice for the early game. You are going to be able to see this in use in later game builds as a stopgap until they get their perfect options. Unbending Will, so it's built into a sword. This is for your melee builds, especially Barbarian, since it gives a bunch of plus to skills there. It has chance to cast Taunt on striking. That's a pretty cool addition. It's much better when you're using it on the Barbarian itself, because you're going to be able to move monsters around the playing field, but really high increased attack speed, huge enhanced damage, a lot of really good stats, along with Prevent Monster Heal, which is useful when you're fighting Declone and kind of only Declone. But this is a really, really nice mid-game option that helps people get into a melee Barbarian before they get better options like Oath and then eventually Grief. Wisdom. Wisdom is probably my favorite rune word from what they've shown. It is a helmet that says cannot be frozen, mana per kill, mana stolen per hit, and 33% piercing attack. This almost single-handedly empowers the Double Throw Barbarian to get to 100% pierce. It is absolutely the best in slot on a Boazon until you get into like your end game options, so that you can save as many points from pierce from the pierce skill, and you also don't have to use Razor Tail anymore. This thing is absolutely nuts if you put it onto any melee build. It single-handedly fixes all your mana problems on a Whirlwind Barbarian, and it has cannot be frozen, so you don't need that Raven Frost, you don't need a Cham Rune. This thing is one of the strongest early game rune words that you're going to see on end game builds until they get into Griffins on a Lightning Fury Amazon, for instance. But everybody is going to use this if they throw a weapon, and even some other melee builds are probably going to build it. There's a lot to talk about Obsession. I won't go into everything, but I think the biggest takeaway here is that this staff basically says every single stat you would want it to say for a caster. And since it's built in staves, it's a 6-socket staff. You'll have to use an Archon staff. But with the +4 to skills and the staff mods that you can get, this staff says +7 to Meteor, +7 to Blizzard, +7 to Cold Mastery. It's very, very powerful. It's very competitive with a dual spirit setup. And it's one of the only things that you're actually going to build with a Zod. So at least those Zod runes are going to have some type of value. Flickering Flame is legitimately the first instance of what I would consider to be power creep coming in patch 2.4. Flickering Flame single-handedly makes one item no longer the best in slot. So a Fire Druid used to use Raven Lore. Raven Lore is basically Flickering Flame, but on a Druid pelt. And the fact that you can put this into a socketed Druid pelt that can also say +3 to skills means that you now have a +6 skill helmet, not to mention all of the other stats. So the high level resist fire aura maxes out at 106 fire res. Put this on you, basically solves all fire resistance problems. Put it onto a mercenary, solves all their fire, solves all of their resistance issues for fire. This will offset the minus fire res that is very typical on Act 2 Mercenary that uses Indariel's Visage, so that you can put a stronger jewel into their helmet. It's an absolute powerhouse, and it costs a pull and a Vex. So every single Fire Druid, after they build their Hodo, which also needs a pull, so Heart of the Oak, which also needs pull and Vex, is absolutely going to build this the moment that they find a really good base to put it into. It has huge applications for other fire builds. It's not necessarily best in slot in all of them, but it's a very strong competitor and probably going to be used until you do transition into your best in slot. So this item across the board is just absolutely fantastic and is finally going to retire the chicken hat of Raven Lore. So RIP to all the Raven Lore fans out there. I'm also going to miss +7 to cast Raven, but what can you do? And then the Mist Bow. So the Mist Bow is a very, very interesting item here. This giving a concentration aura when equipped means that your Act 1 Mercenary is now pretty competitive against an Act 2 Mercenary. It also says 100% Pierce, so that means that you don't need any other Pierce on any gear or putting any points into the stats. That has huge implications. It saves you a ton of points on a lot of builds. Yes, it uses a Cham Rune, which is at least more expensive than a Zod Rune, but other than Plague, really doesn't get used except on super high-end builds when you want Can't Be Frozen in a socket. This bow is a massive gateway for any physical boazons until you can make a Faith or a Wind Force. It is a huge consideration for using an Act 1 Mercenary. It's a massive ton of stats. The fact that it says +3 to all skills and you can put it into either a Grand Matron bow or a Matriarchal bow that have the benefit of saying +3 to bow and crossbow skills means that you have a +6 skill bow, and that is absolutely fantastic. I want to mess around a little bit with putting it into a crossbow just because there's a little bit of use on like a werebear using a crossbow of this, and also just putting it on your summon druid so that you can give all of your minions concentration. Or there's a lot of really cool options for this bow, and I think it's kind of like the perfect balancing act of power versus rarity, and it pushes the envelope for a lot of different stuff but doesn't completely obliterate anything else in the game. It's very, very interesting.
All right, then we got a couple new Horadric Cube recipes here. Dev comments, we felt that players enjoy the current Horadric Cube recipes for upgrading unique items, so we decided to offer the same capability for upgrading set items. This can add more possibilities by using lower level set items for more character builds. So something that not all players, I guess, newer players are aware of, unless they've gone to like Max Roll and looked up the cube recipes, is if you find some unique at level 10, and you out-level the item at higher level, you could, it's not always worth it, but you could do a cube recipe to upgrade the base item into the higher level version of it that's going to have higher stats. Do you want to expand on that, Mac?
Yeah. So in most instances, this is most important for 2 item types or 3 item types. So boots. For like an assassin, when you kick with boots, it deals damage equal to the base boot. But just like you said, if you outlevel that base boot, maybe it has a lot of really good stats, but that base has really low kick damage, you could upgrade the boots and now you get more kick damage. For weapons, you start off with an axe. Axe only does 8 to 12 damage, but it has really, really good stats on it. Well, you can take that and upgrade it to the next tier. So you're going to increase the base weapon damage, and then that's going to get modified by all of the rest of the stats on it. So there are a couple different instances where you would upgrade the base of an item. the most the most interesting one, and we'll get into this when we talk about the set items, is that belts give you a number of potion slots equal to their base. So if you can upgrade a belt, you will get more potion slots. So there are a lot of really strong like belts in the game that sadly only gave you 4 extra potion slots. So you really couldn't use it in the late game unless you wanted to walk around with 8 potions on your belt as opposed to 16. But yeah, this Hereditary Cube recipe opens up a lot of cool space for some of the set items that have really good stats on them. But again, they're a really low quality of weapon base, or they're a really low level belt, so they only give you a certain number of slots. And either the shield, that's another example. So shields give smite damage equal to their base. So a smiter might have a super good shield, but it's on a low damage base. This gives you more options for being able to upgrade those items and keep them relevant for longer for pretty low investments of both gems and runes.
Are there any obvious set items that would greatly benefit from this that jump to mind?
Yep. So the example that I was using before with the belt, one of the best belts in the game is the Death Set belt. So it's a base level sash, but it says cannot be frozen. And then if you use the gloves on top of that for the set, you get 30 increased attack speed, 10 all resistance. It's a really, really powerful set. In fact, some people use it on endgame builds and also use it in PvP. The problem is that you can only have 8 potions when you're using a Death's belt. So I think this is probably like the poster child of set items that you would want to upgrade. Other options that come to mind, there are a couple set boots that would be really nice to upgrade for kick damage. Aldur's weapon, which is a really strong weapon, a lot of increased attack speed, but it is the exceptional, not the elite version of the base weapon, so you would upgrade that for more damage. There are a couple other options that are a lot more niche. The only thing you wouldn't really upgrade typically is like armor and helmets, because typically, while you get a little bit of additional defense, it also increases the requirements to be able to use the item. So you're going to need a lot more strength to wear it, et cetera, et cetera. But on high strength builds that are using, early game set items, you can definitely upgrade them and get that benefit of the defense while never really having to pay attention to the requirements on them. So there are a lot of good options. Also, the Arctic set comes to mind. The Arctic set is like a really good early game bow set. And the fact that you can upgrade the weapon means that weapon's base damage stays relevant with you and you can continue to use it for longer. So yeah, there's just a lot of really cool opportunity for a little shenanigans with the Hereditary Cube now.
All right, then we're seeing some set item bonus changes. The dev notes, many improvements have been made to set items that are generally underused by players. These will offer more reasons to equip multiple of these set pieces and to give some sets new capabilities to make them stand out more, which further fuels more build diversity. So again, some balance changes, some buffs here. Any that you want to particularly highlight?
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot here, and they're all going to be felt slightly differently. I think one of the most important ones that I would point out is something like Aratha's Finery. Aratha's is a set that when you have the full set on, so it is an amulet, helmet, boots, and a belt. When you put all of this on, you get a ton of max resistance added onto your character, as well as additional resistance to get you up to that cap. And the fact that it now says piercing on it means that this is a really good option for your hardcore playthroughs, on your bows, on your new double throw barbarian. So that's like to give people a framework within which to try to understand these changes or how valuable they are. You want to think about what are they adding to it and what does that mean for builds and how viable they are. Other than that, Naj's set is a very cool set, and now it's going to have a ton of additional magic find on it. It's going to have plus to skills specifically for fire builds. So Naj's set is a 3-piece set. It's a staff, a helmet, and a body armor. So you're more incentivized to use that one. I think people are going to see some use out of it in the mid game for leveling. Sazabi's set, which is a helmet, armor, and a weapon, was already really good and was actually like a fairly decent budget option for like a frenzy barbarian. Now this thing is going to have damage reduction on it, plus to all skills, additional poison length reduction that people typically overlook, but is really, really impactful. Again, single self-found early game melee builds need additional survivability, as well as hardcore playthroughs. Like, that's phenomenal. And I think overall, this hasn't made it so that every single set is now phenomenal, but it's given some of these sets that were really close to being usable and viable at different stages of the game that little extra nudge that they need to like really become like a fully considered set of gear that you would actually want to use multiple pieces of.
And then I guess we got the next section, the level area changes. First off, one of these changes is not going to be popular. Players must now smash the compelling orb.
We block that one out. Maybe we can still convince them to change that one back. Not to go into whether or not I agree with their ideology of why they're making this change. Basically, they want people to play the game, and I don't think that that's a crime. Right now, the meta is after the first weekend or so, people will rush you for a charge, typically either a socket quest or your Hellforge. And they're making it so that the person who is rushing you now has to do more work to rush you through Act 3. Because on a single player playthrough, on your first playthrough, you already had to do this quest to get into Mephisto and progress on to Act 4. So this really only impacts rushing. And the problem with it is that, especially on Hell difficulty, a lot of the areas in Act 3 are actually very dangerous. So the Spider Cavern has a super unique that spawns right on top of the chest called Cesark. She's extra strong. She curses you, so you take plus 100% physical damage. And now you'll need to be able to clear out that area so that your very low-level rushee will be able to actually walk in and get the items. The sewers in the sewers level 2 is an absolute nightmare to find. It's in a random location, and there's only one small hint on how to find it, and that's only if you find the chest that's also in a random location. And then on top of that, especially on Hell difficulty, there are really dangerous monsters down there. You can spawn the little fetish dolls who will explode. But again, you need to be able to clear them out so that the person can safely retrieve the item. And then the last one is the Flayer Dungeon. On our speedruns, like with a full 8-player elite team, getting through the Flayer Dungeon without having to drink an entire belt full of rejuve potions is very, very difficult. You have bone fetishes, you have huge elemental damage, you have ghosts, and you have spirits. Casting lightning at you. So this is another thing where you're going to have to be able to safely get through it. So everybody who does rushes are going to need to be multi-elemental, high survivability builds. So I don't even know if the Sorceress is going to be the best option for it anymore. It might end up, turning over to Hammerden, who's going to be able to survive those areas and kill everything very easily. Just another feather in the cap for why the Hammerden is best for everything. So I understand the change to a degree. I understand the intent, but I think that the fallout of it is just a worse gameplay experience. But that's my words. That's my personal opinion, just to give you some insight on kind of the ramifications of it.
It's very well explained. A lot of people have expressed negativity towards this, but haven't been able to phrase it so eloquently. So very well said. But I guess the good news here is we are seeing a number of zones be brought to level 85. You want to explain why that's important?
Absolutely. So everybody who's going to be either playing the game themselves or watching content knows that the hollowed area level 85 is what you want. And the reason why you want that is basically once the area is level 85, all the monsters in that area are equal to that level. So if it's a base monster, just a random skeleton walking around, they're also level 85. If it's a champion pack, so your small group of blue named monsters, they're going to be level 87. If it's a boss pack, so, Spitfire the Wretched or whatever their name's going to be, they're level 88. And what that means is they can drop any item in the game, them and the champions. They are high enough level to drop any item in the game. Why is that so important? Because if you can farm areas with weak monsters in them who are level 87 and 88, you can drastically increase your chances of finding those super rare, super GG items that everybody is willing to pay a pretty penny for. Adding more area level 85 sections to the game isn't just about breaking up the monotony of farming, because that is one of the biggest benefits. Right now, people farm cows, they farm ancient tunnels, they do key runs, they farm Chaos Sanctuary, and maybe Worldstone Keep and Bale. That's your most average person's kind of experience farming in the game. Adding more areas that are now super high value, the highest value that they can be, each of those areas has different monster types and different immunities in them and different dangers or weaknesses or benefits. Just like as an example, the Stony Tomb in Act 2 is right outside of the city. It has very easy to kill masses of undead. It has a ton of poppable and clickable items. And in other spaces where we've seen experimentation like this, in like the mod scene, the Stony Tomb becomes one of the best farming spots for the beginning of the ladder, especially on fire builds, since nothing in there is immune to fire. So that's what I'm talking about when I mean immunities and farm diversity. It's these areas are now just as high value as other places, and your more niche builds are going to be able to get to them and quickly. The Swampy Pit, don't farm the Swampy Pit, but the Swampy Pit is right next to the waypoint in the Flayer Jungle. So you don't need teleport to farm there. You take the waypoint and you walk into the Swampy Pit. So now your low mobility character that has a huge kill speed and really high magic find, but can't afford or doesn't have Enigma yet, can farm right there. The Arachnid Lair is right next to the waypoint. The Disused Fane and the Ruined Temple are right on the map near the waypoint, and especially the Ruined Temple has a super unique in there with a massive amount of minions with her. So now they're level 85 theoretically. So you have a ton of monsters to kill and potentially get drops from. I could go on, but this is such a fantastic change. And this is basically buffing a ton of very niche builds and removing them from obscurity, because now they can get to high value farming areas without needing to have the best gear in the game and being a cookie cutter and just using Enigma. So it's not just that there's more places to farm, it's that builds can actually farm now.
That's very well said. Yeah. So touching upon the first aspect of it, though, like breaking up the monotony and having more areas to farm, is there any concern at all that while we're getting more areas that can be farmed, this might actually result in a reduction in variety of what we do if it so happens that one of these zones turns out to be the vastly most efficient place to farm?
So on paper, that could be a concern. Luckily, we've already done the litmus test of seeing these types of changes in the mod community. So a ton of mods have changed a lot of these similar areas to level 85, and that's why I'm so well acquainted with Stony Tomb. Now, the thing is, every one of these areas has some of their downsides. The Abaddon, the Pit of Acheron, the Infernal Pit. I promise you there are people who literally don't know what those things are. They're the big red cool hell portals in Act 5 that you never go in. But
or you go in once and you see that there's like a little crappy chest and then you never go in there again.
There is a crappy chest at the end of a very long winding road and about 3 skeletons playing a game of cribbage in there. There's nothing in there to kill. So bumping them up to area level 85 is cool for the person who happens to walk in once or twice. But that's not enough to really make this a high priority farming area. Now, seeing the ramifications of adding more farming places in other scenarios and in other games has only ever shown to just increase build diversity and decrease burnout. Because as much as I love farming Eldritch, Pindle, and Shank for a million years on my Lightning Fury Amazon until I have Infinity and until I have Enigma, it will be cool to walk outside and go to the Stony Tomb. It'll be cool to hop off the waypoint and walk into the Arachnid Lair. That has really good mob density and really small corridors that enable some people to be able to farm really well and also, may not be the best for other farming areas. I'm almost positive that across the board it is only good. And they would have to, I'm not even sure which area they could empower that much to make it so that you wouldn't farm anywhere else. So I don't think that we have to be concerned at this point based off what we've seen.
That's good. That's reassuring. All right. And I guess that's basically it. We have here general gameplay changes. Character hit block will no longer apply while your character is playing a skill precast animation. Character hit recovery will now have diminishing returns when being hit by another player. What kind of ramifications will these have on gameplay?
Oh, those are actually pretty massive. So let me just reread that. So the character hit block will no longer apply while they are starting an animation, basically. So the way that skills work in the game is that they have a full animation length, and everybody's pretty well accustomed to that. They also have something called an action flag. An action flag is a certain number of time into your animation is when the effect goes off. So a really good example of this is when you right click to summon a clay golem, that clay golem is immediately on the screen. It has a very short action flag time. Whereas using something like Mind Blast on an assassin, Mind Blast actually has a very long action flag. So it's really deep into the animation when the effect goes off. So the fact that blocking will typically interrupt everything. So if you successfully block, you will stop what you were doing. And at the end of your block, if you're still holding down the trigger, you'll then try to recast your ability. It sounds like what they're saying is that before the action flag goes off, you can't be interrupted by block. Outside of PvP, that's just really, really nice. I'm pretty curious to see what builds are going to feel better with this mechanic in play. It's definitely going to make going for max block feel a lot better across the board. For PvP, this sounds pretty broken. The PvP scene in D2R has been so volatile because, everybody's trying out new stuff. Skills don't work the same. Weapon speed bugging doesn't work. Weapon swap bugging wasn't work for breaking out of stun locks. And then the IS cap was removed, but then it got put back in. Certain skills just did ridiculous damage. So this is throwing a little bit more gasoline on the fire. But that being said, I would definitely need somebody who's much deeper into PvP to give you the full ramification of character hit recovery now having diminishing returns. But that's pretty significant. Basically, before you could hit your max hit recovery breakpoint, so you would recover very, very quickly from being hit, which would make it easier to get out of stun locks. Now it looks like that's going to undergo a modifier when PvPing. So either you're going to have to put a much higher amount of gear on, or it might swap out the meta, depending on what your build is, to more heavily rely on dodge or more heavily rely on block as opposed to hit recovery. So I definitely think that this is going to change up a good amount of matchups. But I'd have to sit down with somebody who PvPs every day to really know what that number is actually going to look like in a tangible sense.
That's fair. All right, and that about wraps up all the changes. Again, massive patch notes here. Overall, lots of great stuff, and we're going to thank Mac here, Macro Bioboy, for his wonderful insight and analysis on all this. Where can people find you, Mac?
Yeah, Rick. So I'm at Macro Bioboy everywhere, MACROBIO, and then here's the twist, BOI. That's my little. There you go. That's how you can find me. Twitter, Macro Bioboy, Twitch, YouTube, Macro Bioboy, everywhere. So if you're the kind of person who needs this level of nerdery and number crunching breakdown, I'm your guy.
And that's going to wrap up this video. But do leave a comment with your thoughts on all these changes. What are you most excited about? Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch, Patreon, and YouTube supporters for making these videos possible. If you like what you see on this channel and want to support the creation of more content, you can consider pledging on YouTube or Patreon and unlocking behind-the-scenes content, monthly virtual hangouts, and more. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. Check out these other videos and subscribe to join Riker's Raiders for more Diablo content.